And good afternoon. You're listening to Ken Hudnall. This is the Ken Hudnall Show. Coming to you from our studios right here in exciting El Paso, Texas. Gateway to the Old West and the most haunted city in the country. Well, today's January the 12th, 12th day of this new year. Just 353 days remain to the year's over with, and we'll start a new one. Well, holidays and observances. It's Kiss a Ginger Day. Get up close and personal with a redhead. Show appreciation for the gingers in your life, or give your hair some TLC with styling and products. National Youth Day. National Hot Tea Day. And National Curried Chicken Day. National Pharmacist Day. National Clean Your Desk Day. National Fourth Graders Day. Enthusiastic students embarking on an educational journey full of curiosity and growth. National Marzipan Day. Plow Monday, celebrating a rural tradition. Lively customs mark a community start during festivities at the beginning of the year. Work Harder Day. National Gluten-Free Day. Feast of Fabulous Wild Men Day. National Kettlebell Day. Coming of Age Day offers an excellent reason for young folks to celebrate their entrance into adulthood. And Artes Mundi, famous people born on this date: Rick One, Howard Stern, and Rob Zombie. Well, all that having been said, let's see what stories we have in the news, because there's always something going on in this crazy world. Well, Democratic Committee Chair has compared the U.S. to Iran, claims both countries are killing protesters. Democratic National Committee Chair Ken Martin compared the U.S. to Iran in several social media posts on Sunday, claiming both countries are guilty of killing protesters. Martin made his first comparison on X, expressing support for both protesters in the U.S. and Iran for rising up against systems that yield violence without accountability. From Tehran to my birthplace in Minnesota, people are rising up against systems that yield violence without accountability. And he proceeded to rant and rave for a few minutes. And he said, here at home, tens of thousands are marching after the fatal ICE shooting of Renee Good, demanding justice and transparency and an end to an unchecked federal force that takes lives and tears families apart. He was talking about ongoing protests against the Iranian government that have led to dozens of deaths and thousands of detentions by security forces trying to clamp down on demonstrations. And Minneapolis, of course, made headlines last week after an ICE agent fatally shot Renee Nicole Good, who allegedly attempted to drive her vehicle toward officers. Well, of course, whichever definition you give her acts, both sides of the political aisle are claiming her she was a hero. Well, the refugee flood isn't smart policy. It's the gift that keeps on taking. Saga federal benefit fraud in Minnesota is still being told. Governor Tim Walz dropping out of his bid for re-election to a third term is only the latest chapter in this saga. Reports of fraud in children's operations and the connection to Twin Cities Somali immigrants go back almost a decade. State politicians and legacy media initially ignored or downplayed the story, probably because most of the perpetrators are from a minority that carries a intersectional clout in woke circles and electoral clout for Democrats. 2025, the magazine County Highway reported in depth on the scam, followed by the City Journal and finally even the New York Times. Walz, who's been in power for nearly 8 years, tried to shift blame away from himself and Somalis onto President Trump and conservatives for noticing it didn't work. But there's an underlying story that's no less important, a much larger cost of absorbing millions of low-skilled immigrants. Back in 2016, George Borjas of Harvard wrote that the higher cost of all the services provided to immigrants and the lower taxes they pay because they have lower earnings inevitably implies that on a year-to-year basis, immigration creates a fiscal hurdle and hole for at least $50 billion. Because most Somali immigrants came to the U.S. as refugees or on family reunification visas. They're an interesting subset to examine. At a press conference, Minnesota Democratic Representative Ilhan Omar said of her Somali constituents, we've become nurses and doctors and engineers, paid for by the American taxpayer, of course. Well, the U.S. raid in Venezuela signals a deterrence to adversaries on three fronts, according to experts. The U.S. operation to capture Venezuelan leader Nicolas Maduro has ignited sharp debate in Washington and abroad about whether the move undermines international norms or delivers a deliberate deterrent message to rivals like China and Russia. Critics argue that seizing the leader of a sovereign nation risks setting a dangerous precedent, one that adversaries could cite to justify their own military actions beyond their borders. According to Representative Don Bacon, Republican of Nevada, my main concern now is that Russia will use this to justify their illegal and barbaric military actions against Ukraine, or China to justify an invasion of Taiwan. What are you going to say now? Putin tries to capture Zelensky. Representative Ro Khanna, Democrat of California, asked. Others counter that such norms have never constrained Moscow or Beijing before, and that deterrence is shaped less by legal arguments and by demonstrations of power, speed, and capability. And certainly going in and bringing Maduro out did put people on notice. We do have the capability, and we're not afraid to use it. Well, President Trump says Iran's starting to... And everything went dark. They're starting to cross U.S. red lines as protesters die in government crackdown. President Trump said Sunday Iran's starting to cross U.S. red lines, citing reports of civilian deaths and warnings that any attack on American interests would be met with overwhelming force as his administration weighs what he called very strong options. He spoke to reporters aboard Air Force One while traveling from Palm Beach, Florida, back to Washington, D.C., after being asked whether Iran had crossed the threshold that would trigger a response. He said they're starting to, it looks like, and there seems to be some people killed that weren't supposed to be killed. These are violent. If you call them leaders, I don't know if they're leaders or they just ruled through violence, and we're looking at some very strong options. We'll make a determination shortly. Some protesters were killed in a stampede. Others were shot, Trump said, adding that he receives hourly briefings and will decide based on ongoing reports. I think if Iran has to face the same thing that Venezuela did, we may have the Ayatollah Khomeini in a cell beside Maduro. Well, an ex-husband's been charged in the Ohio dentist double murder to appear in Illinois court for possible extradition. The ex-husband of an Ohio dentist's wife killed in a double murder is expected in an Illinois courtroom this afternoon as extradition proceedings are expected to begin. Michael David McKee, 39, was arrested for allegedly killing a couple in Columbus, Ohio. Police in court, the records show. Police responded to a home in Columbus, Wineland Park neighborhood about 10 in the morning on December 30th and found Spencer Tepe, 37, and Monique Tepe, 39, both dead with gunshot wounds. McKee is Monique's husband. Apparently, he took exception to her new family. McKee was booked at the Winnebago County Sheriff's Office in Illinois just before noon on Saturday. That's according to jail records. He's being charged with 2 counts of murder in Ohio in relation to Spencer and Monique's deaths. Court records in Ohio show Monique filed for divorce in 2017 after getting married to McKee on August 22nd, 2015. McKee has lived in several states, including Virginia, Nevada, and Illinois since 2020, according to public records. Recently moved to Chicago and is a vascular surgeon in the Rockford, Illinois area. And he threw it all away to kill his ex-wife. Well, Golden Globes host Nikki Glaser mocked CBS News as the best place to see BS News. She's a comedian, and she mocked the CBS News as the home of the BS News in her monologue for the 83rd Golden Globe Awards ceremony Sunday night. And the award for most editing goes to CBS News. Yes, that's CBS News. America's newest place to CBS News, she said. Over the past year, CBS has experienced several controversies, now a new ownership that led to new leadership, but some critics accuse the network of losing its credibility. Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem accused CBS of editing her Face the Nation interview in September. CBS News later announced that Face the Nation interviews will be broadcast live or live to tape in response. Well, things are strange enough without changing interviews. Former child star Jeanette McCurdy reveals a grooming red flag she missed dating an older man at 18. Called out what she described as a classic grooming line while opening up about dating a man twice her age when she was just 18. She talked about the age gap relationship and the common red flag to watch out for while promoting her debut novel. Former Nickelodeon star wrote half his age, inspired by her own experiences. Said her decision to date an older man at a young age felt justified at the time, shaped by a belief that she was unusually mature and emotionally self-sufficient. She recalled thinking that she was mature, thinking she was so smart that this could happen. She remembered thinking, oh yeah, there's just something about me that's a little different, like I'm special. That's what it felt like to her. She's special. She can connect with older people. Younger people aren't on my wavelength. Didn't quite work out the way she thought. Well, Federal Reserve Chair Powell is under criminal investigation over the renovation of his headquarters. They're investigating whether he was truthful about a $2.5 billion project during congressional testimony. U.S. Attorney's Office for the District of Columbia is opening a criminal investigation into Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell, focusing on the renovation of the central bank's Washington headquarters and whether he was truthful in his congressional testimony about the project. What kind of building are you building that costs $2.5 billion? Officials told the New York Times, that it was the first one to report the probe, that it centers on whether Powell accurately characterized the scope and cost of the renovation during congressional appearances. Powell confirmed the Federal Reserve had been served. He said he respected the rule of law and congressional oversight, but described the Justice Department's move as unprecedented and politically motivated. Yes, everything is politically motivated. Nobody's really doing anything wrong. Well, normally the Supreme Court hears cases that deal with matters of law. But on Tuesday, January 13th, that's tomorrow, the justices will also be dealing with basic science. And not only that, they'll be debating fundamental truth. There was a young lady who said she was told she was a boy. And in that case, they're saying the Supreme Court has to destroy lies that harm women like her. The stakes couldn't be higher in this particular case. West Virginia versus PBJ. Specific question facing the courts is simple. Should transgender boys be allowed to compete on girls' sports teams? But you can't really answer that question without asking a more important one. Can a young boy or a young girl actually change genders? Well, that's a question of basic science. And there's a lot of people in this country who swear that you can change your gender just by identifying yourself as something else. This young lady said she was a classic tomboy, girl who didn't act and dress the way other girls did. She never felt like she fit in, but instead of realizing that she was in a normal phase of life, she got suckered into a world of social media and video games. And that's where she met people that said no, she wasn't actually a girl. They told her she was a boy, that she should change her body to reflect who she was on the inside. And she believed them. And she went to doctors who gave her puberty blockers and blocked her normal development. And soon after that, they started her on cross-sex hormones, so she started to look more like a boy. And then at age 15, the doctors gave her a double mastectomy. Figured without a girl's chest, she'd finally be happy. As a boy, always she wanted to keep her breast. But by age 16, she said she realized how wrong she was. She couldn't go back, though. Puberty blockers and hormones changed her body to the point no longer recognized herself in the mirror. And the chest surgery, how do you undo that? Now she's in her early 20s, and to this day she has bandages where her breast used to be. Well, people have a lot of strange ideas. Well, the Eagles' Nick Sirianni and A.J. Brown are screaming at each other on the sidelines during a wild card round versus the 49ers. Tension's always high during the NFL playoffs, but it spilled over between the head coach and star wide receiver on Sunday afternoon in Philadelphia. Eagles head coach Nick Sirianni and receiver A.J. Brown were spotted on the Fox broadcast going face-to-face with each other on the sideline, to the point where team chief security officer Big Dom DeSando had to get in the middle of it and break it up. Well, tensions do run high, and there's a lot of money at stake. Well, Colombian singer Yosan Jimenez dies in a plane crash hours before a scheduled performance. He's a 34-year-old Colombian singer-songwriter, died in a plane crash just hours before he was supposed to be on stage. On Saturday, a plane crashed in the sector between Paipa and Duitama in Colombia. Special Administrative Unit of Civil Aeronautics announced on X 6 people on the flight were killed, one of whom was the singer. Well, Nikki Glaser roasted Leonardo DiCaprio's dating history during the Golden Globes opening monologue. He has a penchant for dating younger women, and that was on Nikki Glaser's mind as she opened the 83rd Golden Globe Awards Sunday in Los Angeles. During her second stint hosting the Globes, Glaser, who's 41, took aim at the one battle after another actor's dating history. She said Leonardo DiCaprio was here for one man bun after another. She said, detailing a number of the star's career accomplishments. What a career you've had. Countless iconic performances. You've worked with every great director. You've won 3 Golden Globes, an Oscar, and the most impressive thing is you would accomplish all that before your girlfriend turned 30. That's just insane, she said. Well, a lot of actors especially like to date folks much younger than them. Well, the FDA has a recall of cheese products, been upgraded to the highest danger level over listeria-causing bacteria. The Embryola Company first issued a voluntary recall in November. Food and Drug Administration announced that a recall of cheese products had been upgraded to the most serious risk category. They tested positive for potentially deadly bacteria. The Embryola Company first issued a voluntary recall in November for certain cheese products produced at the company's facility in West Caldwell, New Jersey, after routine testing confirmed the presence of Listeria monocytogenes, bacteria that can cause severe illness and even death, particularly among pregnant women, the elderly, young children, and people with weakened immune systems. Although healthy individuals may suffer only short-term symptoms such as high fever, severe headache, stiffness, nausea, abdominal pain, and diarrhea, Listeria infection can cause miscarriages and stillbirths among pregnant women. Well, when eating the cheese isn't safe, we got a real problem, folks. The ESPN star has ripped the Bears' coach after profane outbursts following a playoff win. ESPN star Dick Vitale wasn't pleased when Ben Johnson on Sunday when the Chicago Bears coach explicit reaction to a playoff win over the Green Bay Packers went viral. Cameras were on, and Mike was hot when Johnson rallied his team in the locker room following a 31-27 comeback victory. He was heard saying, F the Packers, F them. Effing hate those guys. And then he proceeded to go on a rant. It's a game, people. Well, the athletes, coaches, lawmakers, and officials who've picked a side in the Supreme Court women's sports battle makes an interesting list. The U.S. Supreme Court set to rule on 2 cases focused on the issue of biological males in women's sports. Hundreds of prominent figures in sports and politics have publicly taken a side. At least 77 amicus briefs have been filed for the upcoming court review. Some have supported the trans athlete plaintiffs, and some have supported the Save Women's Sports defendants. Athletes, coaches, U.S. lawmakers, other state and federal government officials have signed onto those briefs, declaring their allegiance to the historic legal battle. Well, among the athletes, coaches, and sports figures supporting the Save Women's Sports defendants, we got Martina Navratilova, 59-time Grand Slam champion tennis player. Donna de Verona, Olympic gold medalist swimmer and world record holder. Summer Saunders, Olympic gold medalist swimmer. Riley Gaines, 12-time NCAA All-American swimmer and SEC record holder. Now remember, these are the ones that want to save women's sports. And the list goes on and on and on. And of course, they'll just support the trans athlete plaintiffs. Megan Rapinoe, 2-time FIFA Women's World Cup champion, former co-captain of the U.S. Women's National Soccer Team. Leslie Clarendon, former WNBA All-Star point guard and first openly trans non-binary player in WNBA history. And there's a long list of folks on that side of the coin. We'll see how it plays out. Well, the U.S. used a sonic weapon on Venezuelan troops, according to a report shared by Levitt. Viral story from a man claiming to have witnessed the U.S. operation to capture Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro states the U.S. uses sonic weapons during the mission to incapacitate opposing forces. White House Press Secretary Carolyn Levitt shared the eyewitness interview on X, encouraging her followers to read the statement. The witness in the interview claimed to be a guard who was serving at the Caracas military base where the U.S. captured Maduro. He said, "We're on guard and suddenly all the radar systems shut down without any explanation. Next thing we saw were drones, a lot of drones, flying over our positions. Didn't know how to react." Then he described watching roughly 20 U.S. soldiers deploy out of roughly 8 helicopters over the base. They were technologically very advanced, the guard said. They didn't look like anything we've fought against before. We were hundreds, and we didn't have a chance. We were shooting with such precision and speed, it felt like heat soldiers firing 300 rounds a minute. And then he described the U.S. deploying some sort of sonic weapon against Venezuelan forces. Well, war is not what it used to be. There's no question about that. Well, we're going to go back for today's show and talk about some more conspiracies involving the Vatican. You know, we live in uncertain times. There are wars and rumors of wars, and the price of gasoline just keeps going right up through the ceiling. People are often wondered about the future, wondered and worried. And some would appreciate it if there were those who might be able to see a little bit further down the road than the rest of us. And having said that, the Vatican has actually been at the center of quite a few supposed prophecies. One of the most famous of these alleged papal prophetic ponderings comes to us by way of an Irish saint known as Malachi. Prophecies are essentially, in their brief, vague statements that are said to describe each of the popes and the times in which they live. Things that really keep us up at night, though, is the fact that there's a finite number of these popes mentioned by Malachi, and as with the writing, the current pope, Pope Francis, is believed to be the last one mentioned. And that's apparently bad news for the rest of us, since according to Malachi, after the last pope, the end is near. Malachi insists that the final pope, whom duds Petrus Romanus, will be the final steward of the church before the coming apocalypse. Or in the words of Saint Malachi, Peter the Roman, who will pasture his sheep in many tribulations, and when these things are finished, the city of 7 hills, that's Rome, don't you know, will be destroyed, and the dreadful judge will judge his people. and that'll be the end. Well, the connections to Pope Francis seems vague at first, but nevertheless, some have been made. Although Francis hails from Buenos Aires, Argentina, rather than Rome, he has deep Italian roots on both sides of his family. Both his father and mother were Italians. Also noted by conspiracy theorists, Francis' namesake had a father named Pietro, or as it were, Peter. So is all this a clear sign of Pope Francis being none other than Peter the Roman? Another real doozy as far as prophecies sponsored by the Vatican go is that the so-called prophecy Fatima, or Fatima. This prophecy revolves around a group of 3 small children in Fatima, Portugal. Allegedly had several visions of the Catholic conception of Mother Mary. The visions occurred in 1917, just 2 years before the First World War. These children were allegedly given precise glimpses of the horrors to come. They were shown scenes of terrible war and devastation related to the 2 world wars. And not only this Marian vision allegedly filled those kids in on some other rather stunning details about the purported future events. They were supposedly informed of the world wars, the advent of communism, and the terrible conflagration to come. Seems they saw nothing short of the Battle of Armageddon. Much of the final prophecies were sealed up by the Vatican and were only released in the year 2000. Well, let's see. The prophecies seem to involve the same final pope that Malachi talked about. It would oversee either the end of the world or at least the end of the Roman Catholic Church. This vision was a startling one in which the children were shown the imagery of Rome being in ruins and the Pope leading a procession through the rubble. There were dead bodies strewn everywhere, and the Pope stopped to pray for the dearly departed. And the Pope and his cohorts then made their way up a hill before reaching a gnarled tree in the shape of a cross. And the Pope bows down and prays before the tree, and as soon as he does that, it is mowed down by a hail of bullets. Well, among those who believe in this prophecy, there are some who believe it's a literal vision of a future event, while there are those who think the imagery represents some sort of symbolism. Either way, those who feel it feeds, who believe it feels it's a prediction of some sort of terrible cataclysm the church is going to face in the end times. Well, the official explanation of the Vatican was notably muted, as the papacy seemed to simply shrug its shoulders and suggest the vision represented future persecution of the faith. And this, of course, was nothing more than the stating of the obvious, but there's a catch to all this. There's some that believe that only part of the prophecies was released. According to some Vatican insiders, the actual full prophecy is so shocking that nobody dares to utter it out loud. This seemed to concur with some recent events in the history. It said that a sitting pontiff came close to releasing the details of the final prophecy in the 1960s, but suddenly had misgivings and thought better of it. This pope apparently looked at the file that contained the prophecy and then simply put it back in the secret archives of the Vatican and forbid anybody else to open it. And so, now comes the question, what's all this talk about the final? That is the final Marian prophecy all about. Actually, a meeting of some 100 influential figures in Vatican City in 2010 to discuss the possibilities. Well, among those folks were a prominent legal expert and Catholic scholar by the name of Christopher Ferrara. At the conference, Mr. Ferrara was the one who made his views quite clear. He emphatically stated the evidence points to only one conclusion: something has to be missing. According to Ferrara's research, there are many things that simply don't add up as it pertains to the official Vatican release of details of the purported final prophecy of Fatima. Mr. Ferrara believes that what was released was not the full prophecy, but essentially a heavily redacted version. Well, if it were a declassified file from the CIA, for example, it would be one with several lines blacked out. Ferrara believes that it's only this sanitized, heavily redacted version of the prophecy that's been released. And if that's the case, what's the Vatican trying to hide? Some have voiced their opinion that prophecies are censored because it actually makes the church itself look bad. Well, it's been said that the biggest enemy that the future church might face is not so much from without, but from within. Did the prophecy contain information incriminating about the Catholic Church that the Vatican wants to see the light of day? Well, in light of all the accusations about abuse have been floating around in Vatican City, it wouldn't be at all surprising to folks. There's another explanation that's been offered in an attempt to explain away the third prophecy. It's to suggest that the vision of a pope being struck with bullets was actually in reference to the very real assassination attempt made on Pope John Paul II. That took place in 1981, that John Paul II very nearly lost his life. And this assassination attempt occurred on May 13th, which just so happens to be the feast day of Fatima. You could argue it's a coincidence, but then again, and before we become convinced that the third prophecy was fulfilled by the way of John Paul II's attempted assassination, it's important to realize that Pope John Paul II himself didn't think that was the case. To the contrary, when once again asked about the contents of the prophecy, Pope John Paul II described it as literally being earth-shattering. He said the prophecy was so shocking. It was as if one had just been told that the ocean will inundate continents and the millions of people will die suddenly in just a very few minutes. So what's going on? Was John Paul II reading a different kind of prophecy? A different third prophecy, as it were? Right now, it's just about anybody's guess. And there's an interesting aside to all this, since one of the main features of the original vision was in regard to Russia. And recently, Russia has been in the news quite a bit. In the original visions, the children of Fatima originally shown visions of war taking place in Europe and warned that worse was to come if the Catholic Church didn't consecrate Russia to the Holy Mother's Immaculate Heart. Adding fuel to conspiracy theories shortly after Russia launched its bloody invasion of Ukraine in spring of 2022, Pope Francis gathered several high-ranking priests and bishops, declaring he's ready to pray for peace and the consecration and entrustment of Russia and of Ukraine to the Immaculate Heart of Mary. Well, the children who witnessed the visitations of Mary at Fatima claimed that it was made very clear to them that if Russia, which is Eastern Orthodox, when brought into the Catholic fold and consecrated to the Heart of Mary, then literally all hell's going to break loose. Some suggest the children perhaps had visions of an outright nuclear apocalypse, even though when the vision took place, it was prior to the advent of the nuclear bomb. Whatever the case might be, the Mary apparition is apparently serious about all this and warned the children to pray hard for Russia. She told them, I shall come to ask for the consecration of Russia to my Immaculate Heart and the communion of reparation on the first Saturdays. If they'll listen to my request, Russia will be converted and there'll be peace. If not, she'll scatter her errors through the world, prolonging wars and persecutions to the church. The good will be martyred, the Holy Father will have much to suffer, and various nations will be annihilated. In the end, my Immaculate Heart will triumph. Holy Father will consecrate Russia to me, and it'll be converted, and a certain period of peace will be granted to the world. Well, as it pertains to the current crisis in Russia and Ukraine, as much as the terms World War III and nuclear war have been bandied about, some might indeed consider it quite remarkable, maybe even miraculous, that the Russia-Ukraine war has not sparked nuclear annihilation. Really just takes one nudge in the wrong direction and a terrible conflagration could be ignited. And yet something seems to be holding back the nuclear dogs of war. The world is somehow being held back from the very brink of utter destruction. Could it be a divine hand at work? Could Pope Francis' prayers for the consecration of Russia and Ukraine to Mary have actually made some kind of difference? The fact we're all still here and our planet's not a smoldering pile of radioactive rubble right now makes such a prospect look more and more believable. Furthermore, the fact we've never had a nuclear conflict since the dawn of the nuclear age in the late 40s is nothing short of incredible in itself. Well, further bolstering this practice, a prominent Archbishop of Ukraine, Michael Mokratsky, recently gone on the record in support of these efforts. Archbishop Mokratsky cited our letter of Fatima in 1917, said the consecration will be followed by a time of peace. That time of peace is over now, so we need to repeat the act of consecration of Russia and Ukraine. And we believe this act will be listened to by Our Lady, and she'll intercede before God and for peace in Ukraine. Well, you might wonder if that actually worked, but as he made the comment, we're still breathing, aren't we? The notion that the Catholic devotional group known as Opus Dei, meaning Word of God, is some sort of nefarious secret society is popularized by author Dan Brown. And he's quite good at using Opus Dei as a literary device in his best-selling book, The Da Vinci Code. But other than being a good fixture for Brown's fiction, is there any truth to the idea that Opus Dei is a secret criminal organization? For those who are actually a member of this group, the main tenet of the organization is dedication. And those who belong to this order dedicate their lives to God to such an extent that practically every single thing they do is a work of God. The order was the brainchild of a Spanish priest by the name of Jose Maria Escriva de Balaguer. The order actually grew quite popular during the Spanish Civil War, and several high-ranking officials in the regime of the Spanish fascist Francisco Franco were in fact members. And it's certainly never a good thing to have a group of fascists involved in anybody's origin story, but the question becomes, could such things be an indication that these devotees were up to no good? According to some Catholic insiders, the real reason Opus Dei sometimes seems to take on some rather shady implications is due to the fact that there's a real focus on influencing world readers. And now, whether that influence is for good or for bad is, of course, open to interpretation. But the efforts alone are going a long way to explain why members of Franco's government were actually involved with Opus Dei. For if it was the group's objective to influence high-ranking officials, this would have doubtless been the case, no matter what kind of government Spain might have had. Well, a parish priest by the name of Sean Middleton once put it, Opus Dei has the aura of a secret society. They make no bones about the fact that part of their work is to influence those people who are going to influence society. Considering such things, you can readily understand why Dan Brown found Opus Dei be such a fertile breeding ground for his imagination. Even if the group isn't a secret society, it can really appear to be one. Also, it doesn't help that the group's members often meet in secret. And they're also known to inflict pain on each other through self-mortification. Now, self-mortification, of course, is an old Catholic practice. They really monks never This involved cutting and whipping and all manner of physical discomfort. Modern times, though, many of these methods of humbling the flesh have been abolished for most. Now, of course, it doesn't seem to help. The group members often meet in secret. They're also known to inflict pain on each other through, as I said, self-mortification. And that's an old Catholic practice, or a lot of monks and nuns, after all, who wish to get closer to the suffering of Christ and might have literally inflicted pain on themselves in a form of humility and penance. This, of course, involved cutting and whipping and all manners of physical discomfort. Modern times, though, many of those methods of humbling of the flesh have been abolished. For most, fasting from food is the most extreme form that denial of the self might take. Nevertheless, it said that members of the Opus Dei do indeed still carry out this age-old practice of crucifying the flesh. Dan Brown certainly took artistic license with the aspect of Opus Dei in his portrayals of the group for his best-selling novel and the later film, The Da Vinci Code. Depicted the group as being dark enough to actually drug new initiates for beating them with a barbed Achilles belt. The most damning portrayal that Brown tried to make, though, was his claims concerning a shadowy organization known as the Priory de Sion. The so-called organization centerpiece in Brown's book was allegedly connected to Opus Dei. So the question becomes, what exactly is the Priori de Sion? Most mainstream historians believe it's nothing more than a fabricated hoax, a fictitious fraternal order which was first conceived in the late 50s by a French con man by the name of Pierre Plantard. It's believed that Plantard had a lot to do with setting the wheels in motion as it pertains to this particular mythology. But the Priori of Sion is allegedly a secret cult that holds secret information about Jesus Christ. It claimed Jesus was secretly married to Mary Magdalene and that she actually had his child. And that child went on to found a dynasty of European rulers known as the Merovingians, from which I am descended, by the way. This, of course, quite blasphemous in the eyes of most mainstream Christians. This is a supposed legend behind the Priori de Sion and a large chunk of Mr. Brown's plot. So is there any evidence that any of this is true? Well, no. And does Priori de Sion have anything to do with them? Well, again, the powers that be say no. Pierre Plantard himself ended up recanting his role in the Priori de Sion hoax in 1993 when he got into hot water over forging several documents. Admitted his role in the hoax, was given a stern warning to cease and desist. So he went on to live the rest of his life in virtual seclusion before he passed away in the year 2000. As it pertains to Opus Dei, according to some members of the group, the most radical aspect of their practice is simply the fact that it's out to empower individual members of the church, rather than simply depending on top-down hierarchy of the Vatican. Opus Dei encouraged active evangelism from its members, something that is rather rare in many modern Catholic churches. Even though evangelism has been rather common practice among many Protestants, it was usually only those ordained as priests that could take it to the streets and evangelize as it pertained to the Catholic Church. Opus Dei, of course, tried to change that by allowing evangelism without any elite theological status required. And whatever you might say about Opus Dei, they do indeed seem to be equal opportunists. Well, at this point, we have another question to ask. Was Pope John Paul I murdered? Now, Pope John Paul II is by far the most famous of the John Pauls, but his predecessor, Pope John Paul I, is worth mentioning as it pertains to potential conspiracy afoot in the papacy. With this Pope perished under some rather unusual circumstances. He's known as the Smiling Pope, believed by many and beloved by many. But after just 33 days of his reign as the pontiff, he was found dead with his face twisted in a terrible grimace agony. About John Paul I, whose birth name was Albino Luciani, was a well-liked individual. So if he was indeed murdered, it immediately begs the attention and the question, who would kill such a well-liked individual? He was 65 years old at the time of his death, as a firmly established insider in the Vatican. It was hushed up. And was only in office for a little over a month. He had embarked on some radical shifts when it came to official Vatican policies. It was the day before he perished, in fact, that this Pope was setting in motion what would become some of the biggest sweeping changes in the ancient institution of the Roman Catholic Church. A lot of folks do not realize the reach and scope of Vatican finances. So the fact that the Vatican even has its own bank, but the financial machinery Roman Catholic Church is indeed immense, and there have always been those who recall certain policies and aspects of this financial machinery into question. All you have to do is consider the instigator of the Protestant Reformation, the German priest Martin Luther, and you see a clear vision of discontent within the Vatican's finances. Martin Luther, after all, took umbrage with the fact that his fellow priests were promising the absolution of sins through the sale of little things like indulgences. A priest would allow a sinner a bit of an indulgence, if you will, upon receiving a donation from an apt supplicant. And money would then be used to build churches or other official projects sponsored by the Vatican. The idea of a church raising money for new church buildings and for missionary work, of course, is not all that unusual. And all denominations, in one way or another, still carry out that practice. What Luther hated so much was the fact that priests were basically promising that sins could be forgiven or wiped out simply by donating money. The church's finances and how those finances are both obtained and distributed have always been a point of contention for church commentators. And Pope John Paul I was apparently on the way to ushering in his own form of financial reform. Within the new Pope's sights was the head of the Vatican Bank, Bishop Paul Marcinkus. Mr. Marcinkus apparently knew this was to be the case, he knew that under this new Pope his days were actually numbered. Now, Marcinkus was known as a jovial man, big guy with a big grin, but as soon as Pope John Paul I came into power, he seemed to be noticeably changed. Wasn't quite so friendly, seemed worried, and as the days wore on, even appeared to lose weight. So what was causing this man to be so upset he couldn't even eat? Well, a lot of folks that knew him noticed the changes. Didn't take much to realize that he was sick over impending financial reforms that would rock his world as the head of the Vatican Bank. And there were rumors the new pope would soon completely reshuffle the deck and Marcinkus would be out of a job. Even worse, he might also be under investigation. And in all this was an apparent desire to look into the local Freemasons of Vatican City. At that point in time, there seemed to have been an upsurge in Freemason membership among many of the Pope's own priests and cardinals, even though it had long been expressly forbidden for the Pope's inner circle to be part of such a clandestine organization. And even though that was the case, there was apparently a study that discovered that about 100 of the Pope's closest associates, actually members of the lodge, and it wasn't just any lodge for that matter, they were members of the notorious P2 lodge. Another player in all this was a guy by the name of Robert Calvi. Mr. Calvi is the head of Banco Ambrosio and been speaking openly about his high-rolling associates Umberto Ortolani and Lucio Gelli about his misgivings about the direction in which the new pope was going. Gelli, who was connected with the mob, was often referred to as the puppet master, was the one in charge at P2. Now, Calvi, as it so happens, was also ended up dead before the smoke had cleared. And as it pertains to Mr. Calvi's death, was clearly a murder. Found hanging from a bridge, and it appears that his murder was a hit carried out by members of organized crime. Now, Robert Calvi himself was pretty deep into his own nefarious activities just prior to being bumped off, and was indeed quite concerned about any impending inquiries the new pope might make. Well, those investigations never came, though, since Pope John Paul I died on September 29, 1978. The official verdict was he had died from a certain massive heart attack. Curiously, no autopsies were performed. This, of course, leaves plenty of room for doubt. Even stranger was the fact the Vatican had the Pope's body embalmed just about as soon as he was announced dead. There's no good explanation for this rushed embalming, and of course, this only adds fodder to conspiratorial theories about his death. Could he have been embalmed in order to remove traces of poison? Well, the conspiracy theory has been repeatedly suggested. And in 2019, at least one shady character from the underworld has backed up that claim. His name was Anthony Raimondi, and in 2019 he came forward to insist he was part of a team of hitmen that murdered John Paul I. He just so happened to have been related to the aforementioned Vatican banker John Marcinkus. Claims the Pope was murdered by cyanide. Raimondi's role was purportedly to be a lookout. According to him, he stood in the hallway outside the Pope's quarters when the Pope was given the cyanide as he slept. Raimondi insisted it was his cousin Marcinkus who dripped the poison cyanide right into the sleeping Pope's mouth. Even a few drops ingested by the snoozing pontiff was apparently enough to do him in. Raimondi further asserts that although he was involved in some degree, he was glad he wasn't in the room when the Pope was poisoned. According to Mr. Raimondi, I'd have done a lot of things in my time, but I didn't want to be there in the room when they killed the Pope, and it would buy me a one-way ticket to hell. Raimondi was certainly a well-connected figure in the mafia underworld. Along with being Marcinko's cousin, he was actually the nephew of none other than the infamous Italian mafia boss, Lucky Luciano. Raimondi insists it was indeed necessary to put the Pope on ice because he was getting too close to uncovering a massive stock fraud, a scheme that is being carried out by those in the know, such as cousin Marcinkus. Even so, there were those who refused to believe it, and furthermore, they would not even consider the testimony of such less than reputable characters. Touching Mystery Monday. Jury's still out on what actually happened to Pope John Paul I. But at the end of the day, there's no question something unusual took place. Well, let's talk about some musing about Pope John Paul II. It's on the 13th day of May in the year 1981 that a certain Polish cardinal of the Roman Catholic Church by the name of Karol Joseph Wojtyła was coronated as Pope John Paul II. New pontiff of the Roman Catholic Church was heralded with great fanfare, and a huge crowd gathered in St. Peter's Square to mark the occasion. It's always quite a scene when a new pope is crowned, and always going to be something special about this pope. On that day, from the perch of his so-called Pope Mobile, smiling Pope John Paul II was eagerly waving at those who had gathered as he was driven through the streets. Everybody was in there that day who had the best of intentions in mind. And after the Pope Mobile made a sharp turn down a side street, gunshots were heard. Well, in despair, those who bore witness and saw the Pope crumpling like a crushed flower as blood began soaking his previously white robes. Now, this wasn't supposed to happen according to the general shock consensus of the crowds that day. Shortly after the Pope was hit, that his assailant was spotted and forcibly restrained. The killer would be discovered to be a 22-year-old Turkish national by the name of Muhammed Ali Gia. Muhammad was actually on the lam after somehow escaping from a Turkish jail while he was being held for his alleged role in the killing of a Turkish journalist. Apparently didn't like the journalist's liberal views. Muhammad, was a religious extremist and a die-hard supporter of Palestine. Was of the opinion Israel should return all land to Palestine. In his eyes, Israeli incursions were into formerly Palestine territory are nothing short of a new crusade. And we know who called the original crusade the Pope. So apparently in Muhammad's eyes, history and ideology came conflated together in his twisted brain. The newly Christian Pope, John Paul II, was somehow to blame for the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It was indeed a rather convoluted logic that doesn't make too much sense, but crazier things have happened. Then again, what if there's more to this odd story than we're led to believe? Initially, Muhammad himself claimed to have acted alone, claimed nobody else was helping him, nobody else was behind the plot to get the Pope. But shortly after he got taken into custody, his story began to change. He began to speak about how he was recruited by the so-called PFLP, or Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. Has to be noted, despite those efforts to appeal to Islamic nationalism, the PFLP has Marxist origins. In the 1970s, 80s, countless fronts like this popped up all over the globe. Similar annoying acronyms, from the Quebec separatists of Canada, known as the PLQ, or the Front de Liberation de Quebec, to the Asian Thorn and Ethiopia side, the TPLF, Tigray People's Liberation Front. All these groups, despite their claimed objectives, have their origin in the communist bloc. Well, on that note, we've come to the end of today's show. We'll be back tomorrow. Talk more about some of the strange conspiracies related to the Vatican. Until then, this is Ken Hudnall for the Ken Hudnall Show saying have a truly great evening.